and welcome everyone here to the Mars webinar tonight. It's 9 o'clock here in Germany, and today here at the Market Access and Pricing Strategy consulting company, we have today again a wonderful topic with my boss, with the founder of Mars, Dr. Stefan Walzer. And the topic of today is the EU HTA to come. As you know, Germany has now the presidency of the EU, and it's a big topic. While we should harmonize the reimbursement system here in Europe, as you know, as you probably already know, the health organization and the health economics, it's all national founded. So we have actually here at the European Union 28 different systems. And well, there might be some ideas to harmonize that, but it's not done yet there. So we have the EMA here for the market authorization, but not for the reimbursement. Okay, so the topic today is EU HTA to come, and are there some examples? Here at Mars, next slide, we are your favorable consulting company. We do price and reimbursement for the DACH regions, for Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And also we do the submission for the reimbursement. So for the GBA, for the Swiss BAG, or the Austrian HVB, or even with the digital applications now in Germany, we help you with all providing all the evidence and putting the paperwork together. And of course, we do negotiation, price negotiation with you, support you there so you get the best price for your product. And of course, we support you with surrounding health economics things like posters or calculations and models. Yes, and of course, questions are welcome. I already let you wrote something here in the chat, so feel free to ask questions. After the presentation, which will take about half an hour, we will have time for your questions. So feel free just to write that down in that chat or in the question and answer section here also in Zoom. Both ways will work. And as always, slides will be provided afterwards, so you don't have to make any screenshots. And the video will also be published on our website, which is when you go on the next slide. Yes, you see that section, webinars, and there you find always the present webinar to register. And of course, when you missed the webinar, you find the PDFs of the last ones, and of course, the video recording, the link to the YouTube channel. Well, then I would say the floor is yours, Stefan.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Lutz. As always, good introduction. So coming back directly to the content and the specific topic we have tonight, Lutz said it already. I think it is at least unofficially still on the agenda with the EU German presidency. So it is still the kind of question, EU HTA to come. We put a question mark in there. I think it could also be a question mark and maybe even more. I think that's probably not so much, I think the topic is clearly how could such a kind of EU HTA be potentially implemented? So we'll give you first of all a kind of brief introduction where we stand very briefly, and then we have one potential maybe role model which could potentially then also be applied in Europe in order to, if that was then finally then also decided on an EU HTA over the European Union. I think first of all, a quick disclaimer, because this research was also part of a master thesis, which was especially being developed by Giuseppe Coppoleri, who was writing his master thesis within Mars, and we both basically then worked, me obviously primarily, but I was his supervisor, so that's also part of his thesis. It was just a small part basically of the overall thesis, but the kind of implementation and the example of that was also partly mentioned in the thesis, just that everybody is also clear on which basis the kind of results are. So let's directly start. I mean, Currently, what you see basically, and that's also, I think, what Lutz also said earlier, and that's what you all know, right? What we all know. Currently, we have basically the kind of differentiation, let's say, between a EU harmonized regulatory kind of process, which is based on the EMA kind of procedure, and then also the kind of final recommendation, and then finally a decision, and hence a marketing authorization by the European Commission, which is clearly on a European level. And then if it goes down into the reimbursement, basically where the money is, right? That's also one of the core things, which is also important to remember. The kind of whole financial system, especially in the healthcare, is still very much independent from the European Union. And hence we have currently, and probably as well for the next, at least for the near future, right, national benefit, cost benefit assessments, overall different kind of reimbursement processes which are being applied. I mean, you all know that we have big differences, for example, between some of the, let's say, more cost effectiveness driven countries, like some of the Scandinavian countries. I think we have also, let's say, some countries where they have basically kind of or let's call it maybe a hybrid model in a way, which is still a bit of cost effectiveness, right? But still a good proportion of a benefit kind of assessment. You could probably let's say choose the Netherlands as one example, or a couple of other countries, for example, Austria, maybe, even that they are, for example, also a bit more into the benefit assessment, like Germany and France. And then we have some more, let's say, countries looking more on a, let's call it budget impact, obviously still benefit, but plus than the budget impact, and also more from a national into regional, local environment, which is maybe more the kind of Spain and the Italians in the European Union, what we have. So that's the kind of overall and current kind of situation. Then what happened? I mean, in January 2018, it is already quite a while ago, right? Still already a bit more than 2.5 years. There was some call it proposal. I think it's probably more than a proposal in the meantime, right? But a change in terms of regulation by the EU for an EU-wide binding cooperation in the assessment of health technology. So it's really then the kind of, let's say, recommendation to change what we currently have from a national kind of system into a more kind of broader and hence EU-wide kind of system. And the kind of clear idea behind was also mentioned a couple of times. We also had, for example, a very good kind of round table, I think it was 1.5 years ago in Barcelona, where also the responsible person from the European Union was there. And she was also just saying, look, I mean, we have the kind of clear aim in order to basically improve efficiency, and also then having a sustainable kind of cooperation between national HTA institutions. So it's also that kind of interesting part where we hear, yes, it is European-wide, but it should also be cooperation. So it's not so much basically giving everything away and then just taking something back basically from the European Union, which also might maybe be one of the core drivers in terms of the question with respect to the application of that, let's call it proposal. So here, I mean, you see that just in a kind of different kind of structure. It's basically what we said already, or what I said already a couple of minutes ago. I think we can skip that. I think the more interesting part is especially if you have a deeper look on the figure on the slide you now see. You have basically on the, let's say you have two different boxes here, right? One is more an EU level, which is on the left-hand side, and one is a national level. And then you have different, let's say, different phases and also different involvement. And we just took, because we're based in Germany, the German national federal authorities as an example, easily transferable, obviously, to other countries and jurisdictions. So we have, for example, if you start with the first two, it's more from a regulatory perspective, right? I mean, we have the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, for example, or also the BfArM, the Bundesinstitut für Arzneimittel und Medizinprodukte, dependent obviously a bit always which kind of product you have in your hand, right? Is it a drug? Is it a medical device? Which kind of medical device? Is it diagnostic? All of those kind of different questions. And then it's also still the kind of open question, which kind of regulatory pathway is applicable. But generally, if we just assume there is a pathway through the EMA, then there is a clear kind of European approval process, let's say from the very early stage of the clinical study development let's call it phase 1, 2, and 3. We all know there might be kind of differences for some of the products, but that's a kind of normal stream, right, on a European level. And then you have as well, once you get the official decision, then also from on a European level, then you have also European approval with national validity. So if the EMA / then the European Commission agrees and basically makes the thumbs up, you have a green light, then you can also basically sell, let's call it more launch the product in the individual national European Union countries. So what you then have is on the, I don't want to say lower part, but it's basically on the next level. You have then the involvement of the national HTA authorities, right? Again, for Germany, we just, for simplicity, we have only included the GBA and then also IQWiG. Also here, I think most of you might as well know it. Also here depends a bit on the kind of process finally, on the product, and then also who is finally then being involved. We have the early dialogues, you have the preparation of the evidence for the benefit assessment, which is also, which basically happens as well while the regulatory pathway is still ongoing on a European level. And then you basically move directly into the national kind of level with the GBA decision, for example, if you take drugs on the extent of the additional benefit, and then you have the national pricing. That was the kind of clear kind of pathway currently. And I think the question now is also, is that basically being split up now with that kind of proposal? And if so, would it, for example, look from a national reimbursement perspective very similar to a regulatory perspective, or might that as well be different? But it's also quite clear here there might be as well the differentiation between the different authorities. So what we have taken as a kind of role model, and we have had a look on a couple of different countries to really, let's say, check and assess if different countries and different kind of systems could potentially maybe use as a kind of role model for the application of such a kind of unified joint HTA in Europe. Because at the end of the day, I think there was also some of the core discussions. I mean, also here in Germany with all of the different stakeholders, with the health politicians currently, who are, you know, let's call it split a bit, right? Some are in favor, some are, let's say, against it. I think there are discussions whether the different kind of levels of the, let's say, methods being applied, for example, are still adequate if we move that up from a national into a European level, or is maybe the quality going down? How should we basically as well react to that? What should we do with the current kind of already introduced and quite already long-lasting kind of institutions up and running? So that was kind of cool questions. And I mean, what we got also out of different discussions, also with health politicians out of Canada and also different experts in Canada, was basically there was a similar kind of situation actually beginning of the 2000s in Canada as well. Prior to 2002, also the different Canadian provinces, and there are 13 different and separate kind of provinces and territories in Canada, have also conducted all their own kind of assessments of the added therapeutic benefits. So that was also, let's call it quite similar in a way. I mean, what we currently have in Europe, right? Yes, we have also a couple of further, let's say, differentiation in terms of different languages and all of those kind of things. But overall, I think it sounds very similar to what we have currently in terms of discussions. Also, very interesting when we get more into the kind of details, what happened during those times. There were the similar kind of discussions we also have, right? Some kind of provinces thought, but we have the better kind of quality in terms of methods and being applied, and more stronger, let's say, in terms of pricing. And some of the others were maybe a bit weaker. Ultimately, I think the kind of clear goal for the also the Canadian politician was very clear, that they wanted to basically as well join forces and then also make the availability of new products also more let's say common across the country. So what currently is happening in Canada, I'm not a Canadian expert, right? So it's just more for me. We understood and we analyzed the top level kind of information. We analyzed a lot what happened behind the kind of scenes, which was more that kind of politics and policies around it. And then we try to, let's say, apply that to the European kind of environment. And that was the kind of result that Canada, I think, looks like a kind of role model. So the Common Drug Review, the CDR, was then implemented in 2002 by the CADTH, which is the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, in order to standardize. This is very much on the drugs, right? Drug coverage across Canada by maximizing the use of resources and avoiding the duplication of work. I'm just reading that last part of that bullet, right? Because it sounds very, very similar to what you hear when you speak also with politicians on a European Union level, right? Which is always maximizing use of resources and avoiding duplication of work. That was very interesting to see also in terms of terminologies. So the CDR then, which is then the national, the body above the different provinces and territories in Canada, they basically undertake the HTAs for those new products in order to really analyze and then also get into recommendation for a listing of the product, which is a recommendation to the individual provinces and territories. And not to forget, there's also a kind of, let's say, separate kind of pathway. It's just separately evaluated and assessed. Finally, there as well a couple of further details which we'll not cover today, but there's also a separate one for oncology drugs, which is then called the PCODR. So the other interesting part, because there was also, at least in some of the European countries, that kind of discussion. So what if we do not want to follow, for example, the kind of recommendation? What if we do not want to have as well the kind of assessment on a European level? Just imagine, you know, the kind of situation before the launch of the CAR T cell therapies, right? Very innovative, totally new kind of system, quite costly as well, and only for a very few number of patients. Does every country really want to have that assessment on a European level? Maybe not. It's very specific. So that was also one of the, I think, discussion we also got, for example, when we discussed that with some members of German health insurance funds. And interestingly, also in Canada, there's basically the option to opt out. So there is an opt-out rule, right? At the beginning of each of those assessments, the individual provinces and territories have basically the option of opting out of that joint assessment, which I think was a quite interesting kind of move. Obviously, very much driven from a political perspective, but I think, again, if it's not a standard kind of product, etc., it might be maybe an interesting pathway that you can still say, look, I mean, we do not want to have that for us in Europe on a European level, but maybe it could be still done basically on a national level. So that was as well another kind of, let's say, piece which could also work quite interestingly when thinking on the implementation phase in Europe, especially when it comes to the negotiations between the different countries. So what you have now as well, going a bit further into the details and always having in mind how that could potentially then be applied on a European perspective, right? The CDR process basically and broadly comprises the following four steps. Obviously, very much in detail. There are a lot of guidelines around, right? So it is a very much as well detailed and systematic approach as well in Canada. So a submission is being prepared, obviously, by the manufacturer, and as already mentioned a couple of seconds ago, based on so-called submission guidelines. Very much, I think, what we as well know for most of the countries in Europe. Then there's a review team, which I think is also an interesting part here. It's just that's a two simple words in a way, right? But also based on the discussions we heard and we read as well during that research in the European Union, there was a big kind of debate how and who should basically do that assessment. I think there was a big fear, for example, at the very beginning, at least in Germany, that, for example, only a kind of small team, or let's say, don't call it even team, right? A small kind of group of maybe 2 or 3 individuals from different countries could assess and then evaluate a product which would then be submitted on a European level. So it was a bit of the kind of idea that there would be potentially different kind of, let's say, HTA assessors, let's say a bit similar to, not being in the regulatory expert, but a bit similar what we see from the outside on a regulatory perspective, that the different kind of assessors basically go with the company through the process, and then it's more recommendations on that side. But there was a bit of the fear that just imagine there would be a kind of product just being assessed, for example, by somebody out of let's say countries which are not seen and being to be acceptable, for example, from a GBA's perspective. So I think that kind of review team, I think, is seen a bit broader, a bit bigger. I mean, if you have ever seen a kind of Canadian submission, I think this is also a heavy part, right? Which can, I think, easily be, I think, also compared to a GBA, for example, a submission or a submission in France, I think. So there's then also a kind of draft report which is being developed on the clinical part and also on the economic part as well, which is then also provided for feedback to the manufacturer, including a kind of systematic literature search, which is then being confronted with the evidence which was submitted. And then the report is being again reviewed by another kind of expert advisory committee. So it's the so-called Canadian Expert Drug Advisory Committee. We haven't seen really so much on such a kind of suggestion yet on the European level, but again, this could as well be a kind of lever in order to potentially as well bring the kind of hot discussions on the kind of quality level a bit down as well. So it could as well be potentially something which could be included in a negotiation at a later point in time. So they are then as well evaluating the comparative therapeutic benefits. So it's again already on a kind of more national basis. Keep in mind that also given the fact that there is the opt-out rule, for example, and that also the kind of final pricing decision, which is then coming at the later stage as well, is still done on a territory and a provincial kind of basis, which could then as well be done in Europe, right? A European benefit assessment, and then bringing down that was as well included in the proposal recommendation so far, that the pricing and where basically the money comes in is still a national kind of responsibility. So it could also happen, which is then the kind of, let's say, flip back in a way, that in some situations, especially ones that kind of system would be implemented in Europe, and it is implemented already in Canada since 2002, that in some provinces, maybe the standard of care is maybe different to some other provinces because of different kind of, let's say, pricing negotiations, pricing rules, and maybe as well the opt-out rule. So that's as well, I think, important when we discuss about the comparative therapeutic benefit, because that would also be something on a European level where the benefit assessment would need to be done basically against each of the kind of standards or standard therapies, standard kind of procedures, depending on which product you have in your hand for each of the EU member states. Cost effectiveness is still a question mark, I'd say, in Europe. Also, how this could be then handled. I mean, because there's the cost / the price included, I think it's currently still being seen that this is handled then on a national level. But just keep in mind, this is just the example then on Canada. And finally, there's a simple kind of outcome basically for that recommendation, which is a listing without conditions. So it's a clear green light. And there's listing with conditions. And then there's basically a recommendation of not listing the product based on the submitted evidence. Important then, and that's I think where the interesting part, especially when we think and keep thinking about the European kind of implementation, the very last box here, the recommendation is considered separately by each plan, so by each province and territory as well, which independently then make their own final decision. That is what you see also happening, I think, when you see submissions, especially at the early days, for example, of the costly new cancer products, but also now with the different kind of new kind of ATMPs, for example, that this is also mostly done as an independent kind of decision. So again, it's something where I think the kind of critiques and the kind of fears on national level, also in Europe, could potentially be overruled, at least potentially. Then I think it's also important what I said earlier, the pricing reimbursement is then managed by the so-called Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, PMPRB. I think the names of those institutions are quite interesting and could as well fit quite nicely to the European environment. But I think that it's also quite interesting, I think, what is important and also what is mentioned now on that simple one bullet on that slide as well. And this is basically a slide which is then basically included by further information. So firstly, manufacturers who want a product to appear on the provincial and territorial reimbursement list must apply to the CDR or the PCODR, depending on the product, to make a reimbursement recommendation. So it's a must to first go through that kind of system before you could then potentially find a kind of a negotiated kind of rule or any kind of other pathway on a national, on a provincial territory kind of level. I think that could as well be an interesting move. And I think from a framing perspective, I think in order not to avoid such a kind of European assessment, this could and should probably as well be implemented on European level as well. The list price we're speaking here about, the reimbursement list price, then applies nationally and is then negotiated at the national level between the pharmaceutical manufacturer and the pricing board in Canada. That's basically as well something which could be potentially at least similarly implemented in Europe, right? There's the European benefit assessment, the recommendation, green, orange, red, for example, and then you can go down one further level where we, probably with a kind of further, let's call it pricing dossier or pricing information level. I mean, we have that at least in Germany, for example. You also need to present and submit further information before you start with the negotiation. So you could maybe as well have that on a bit of kind of broader spectrum, add some further national kind of perspective in there, and then you go into a national negotiation. Finally, and I said that already as well already before, the individual provinces and territories basically then decide which of those new products should be included in the basket of the publicly funded services. So that's still the kind of freedom we could as well see potentially then on a European level. So it could still be that some of the products might be, for example, available in France, but not available, for example, Portugal, but maybe available in Poland, but maybe not in Sweden. Could always be, because that's then based on the individual kind of negotiations and maybe price submissions as well after that European level of a benefit assessment. So that was basically the kind of overview, I think, for the Canadian environment, right? I mean, I tried to split that as well and have the kind of jump as well into the European kind of level and the discussions there. I didn't really follow up a lot on the kind of political side there, but I think the discussions and the kind of critiques on it, I think everybody could really follow up and read that as well in the different kind of information since the last 2 years. So does it work in Canada? I mean, to be very fair, I mean, there are obviously as well different kind of opinions on that, right? I mean, overall, and to make it also very simple for us, because we don't have the experience, the direct experience as well in Canada with different submissions. I mean, I worked with some Canadian colleagues in the past on submissions where I just got basically what they told me and what I saw basically, but I cannot claim that I can really make a judgment there. So we made it very simple and easy. We just took a reference out of 2016 where different authors basically said the following: the introduction of the CDR procedure in Canada has proven to be a successful model for harmonizing decentralized HTA assessment in order to enable more efficient use of resources and support health policy decisions in population healthcare, which I think at least generally sounds very interesting, very positive, obviously. And I think it could at least be something seen as a potential role model for Europe. No model is clearly perfect. I think that's the same in Canada. I think also since 2002, there were also different kind of changes and updates and the like. So that might as well be something maybe interesting to take on before implementing that in Europe. So as kind of, let's say, conclusions, I think the rationale behind the establishment of the so-called EUNETA, EU-NET HTA, is similar to the rationale behind the CDR. I mean, EUNETA was already implemented quite some years ago. I personally would say it hasn't really worked that well. I think since the kind of, let's say, proposal, which we have now just taken on board on the joint HTA assessment, I think it was also quite clear that something had to happen, because the financing of Onetta was basically more or less than ending quite close to that. So there was at least the need to find a next step. I think it's also quite clear, I mean, when you take the kind of lead why, for example, the Canadian provinces and territories had the discussion, wanted, at least the majority, to change the kind of current assessment, sounds as well very similar to what we hear as well in Europe. Even though that we have as well to say, I just mentioned at the very early stage and very early beginning, European countries are certainly in many ways more heterogeneous than Canadian provinces and territories. I would at least say that as a European person or living in the European Union, right? Not having basically lived in Canada, but I would just see that from the outside world, right? But I think in general, I think similar concerns have as well been expressed regarding the different access of patients to new medicines. So at least I think the kind of benefit level, so the clinical evidence at that stage is probably something which can then potentially be assessed at the European level. I think the important part is that I think the financing of healthcare will not change over the next probably 10 or 15 years, I think. So there's as well the need to find a pathway from a European clinical benefit assessment into the kind of ways where still the national authorities could decide on the pricing and then also on the availability of the different products. And I try to say that very broadly because we also had that that discussion. I mean, there's a lot of discussion obviously on drugs, but it's, I think, especially on the European level, this is as well something kept in mind, not only for drugs, but especially also for medical devices and diagnostics. So I think that was it, basically pretty much 30 minutes, Lutz. So I hopefully hit the kind of timing point as well. And I'm open as well now for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for this wonderful presentation. Yes, we are open now for any questions or comments you have. Are you the same opinion as Stefan, or even do you disagree or do you agree? We want to know that, as also if you have any specific questions. Yeah, and I actually have a question. You remember that analysis we did with about the psoriasis and other drugs about Europe here, and we saw that it's a really heterogeneous decision we saw. I mean, it's a really colorful picture, or if we take like a red for a negative decision and a green for a positive decision and a yellow for, you know, something in between, and that was really colorful pictures we had, and there was like only the big European countries, the EU5. So what is your personal opinion on that? Will they really, I mean, when I look at this and when I looked at the rational, I had the feeling that, you know, the scientific benefit assessment is actually also like, you know, driven by the politics to give them some reasons not to pay the best price. So what is your personal opinion on that? Will they really give away that word in their hand they have? Because, you know, they can just slice, you know, in the benefit assessment, they make the rules. They just say, oh, we don't make that, we don't like that endpoint. We think the clinical study is too biased, and we saw that clinical studies were fully accepted, and then on the other side there were like, you know, sliced down, so even like, well, this is not worth for any benefit assessment.
Yeah, actually, I mean, look, we have had that discussion. I think since we presented those data, I think was it ISPO probably 2 years ago or so, right? And I mean, the psoriasis is just one example. I mean, another very good one is, for example, diabetes, right? I mean, if you have a look on the different kind of gliptins in Europe, I think they're broadly available in most of the countries, but not in Germany, for example, right? And the lot is basically exactly what you said as well at the very end. I mean, it depends very much on the different kind of acceptance of endpoints, right? I mean, would an HbA1c be acceptable? Is it the patient relevant one? That was the diabetes example. I think psoriasis, I think, was even broader. I think would a PASI 50 or 75 or whatever being acceptable? What about safety and whatever? I mean, it is a big discussion, and we had that, I think, close to basically after the first reactions on that recommendation. I mean, I had a good discussion with a couple of also regional and national German payers around that time, and they agreed with that statement, what you also said, but they also clearly said, look, if such a kind of proposal / recommendation was coming out of the European Commission, something will come. It's just a question or let's say how it exactly looks like and when it comes. I think that basically stuck into my mind, right? And that's basically where we then started as well the kind of, let's say, search in a way, how that kind of implementation could really look like. But I really believe, that exactly what you said at the very end, do they want to give that kind of power out of their hand? I think that there will be probably somehow a kind of European level of a benefit assessment for sure, but I think there will still be very much room on a national level, for example, as well, to let's say push back a bit the kind of price request, and then having quite strong positions still during the price negotiation. If that needs to be solely on the clinical benefit assessment, I'm not sure. Maybe even the assessment could be pushed in the way that all endpoints need to be analyzed on a European level, and then the national authority would basically pick the ones they see as attractive. That's a big question, and it's still, I think, something open for discussion, I think also probably for the negotiation on the European level.
Okay, we have many questions coming in, and the first one is about the EU or the EUNET HTA is not a really successful tool here in Europe, in the European Union. What, in your opinion, how can we improve, or how can the EU improve this process? Which are the key success factors to improve the process?
I personally think this was one of the core points and the core, I think, drivers for European Union healthcare politicians, right? I think EUNETA has generally been seen, I think, from a methodological perspective, maybe as a kind of success. I think if you have spoken with some of the participating methodologists, right? I mean, I think they thought it was a good kind of, let's say, discussion. It was a good kind of level. It was a good kind of communication, in a way as well, cooperation. I would also agree that it was not a success. I mean, I said that at various stages already in the last years. I think it was too slowly, it took too long, and I think it was just not practical, right? I think at the end of the day, I think if you want to make that a success, I think you need to have it, let's say, at least from a legal perspective, somehow binding, right? And that's, I think, where I want to come back what I presented a couple of minutes ago out of Canada, right? If you want to get into national, for us national, but in Canada, maybe on a territory level, a reimbursement and negotiate the price, you need to go through that process. And I think that will be probably something which is important. And I think the other interesting point, what you just then as well added to that question was the potential key success factor. I think the important point here as well, it should not take too long. I mean, to be maybe a bit provocative, I think if we have, let's say, the timelines out of the UK, nice, where an assessment could, I think, also easily take 2 or 3 years, or maybe an assessment out of some other countries where I think it could also take, let's say, 3 or 4 years. I think this will not be a success, right? The benefit assessment needs to be done in a rigorous way, I think, with given timelines. I think similar to what we have, I think, in some European countries, but I think clearly, I think in Germany, I think if you submit it, you know exactly when you get your assessment out, exactly on that date. I think if you have that, then I think it could potentially work on the benefit assessment, and then it goes still down on a national level.
Perfect. The next question is, how do you think opt-out could look like for European countries? Do you fear that the countries will regularly opt out of the process, looking at the rising numbers of ATMPs, for example, which challenge each individual system?
Yeah, also, I think that's also a very interesting one. I mean, I don't have a statistic yet out of the opt-outs in Canada. I think there are a couple of opt-outs, and we have seen that, I mean, during the early days of the oncology, costly oncology drugs. I think where provinces basically wanted to have the product and they wanted simply to have the kind of independence in a way as well to negotiate that price. So they basically really opted out, especially after the first negative assessments by the CDR and then later as well by the PCODR. And then they had the freedom to negotiate that freely. I think the 18Ps could be maybe one of that example. I mean, how do you want to, let's say, assess it, or let's say get it assessed if maybe the kind of evidence is not yet there, if it's maybe kind of, let's call it a red light or a no recommendation. You know, it's then a kind of big question if you can then still basically negotiate still a fair price in a way, a fair price from both sides, obviously, in order to get such products as well available. To be honest, I think I don't have an answer yet. I think it's one of the core points, maybe as well, to further dig into the kind of details of those opt-outs as well. I think in Canada, I really believe it's a really good role model. I think it would also be good, for example, to get further insights from Canadian experts, how they basically changed that. I think to remember that I think the PCODR for the oncology drugs was, I think, also implemented after that kind of issues and changes. So maybe for 18Ps, we need as well a separate kind of pathway. But on the other hand, if you follow the discussions as well in most of the countries, I think also decision makers there basically say we need the evidence. It's the same for orphan drugs, right? Do you want to have a separate then process for orphan drugs as well? Probably not, even though that we know that in some countries we have separate processes. So I think an important point, I think from that, whoever raised the question was I think important to keep in mind, we need to have clear rules for those opt-outs that I think countries cannot just simply, let's say, state, it's getting difficult, I want to get an opt-out now.
Yeah, or it's getting too easy for the pharma company. The evidence is too good and hard to fight to lower the price, and then we just opt out. Not that fair. Yes. Next question is about in that direction. Who do you think will be the beneficiaries of a joint assessment, and who will be the ones who are left behind?
I mean, beneficiaries and being left behind. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, you can obviously already start, let's say, from the different stakeholders here, right? I mean, from, let's say, institutions, right? I think at the end of the day, I would generally say, I think the smaller kind of countries where I think resources may be as well a bit scarce from an institutional level, I think they might as well benefit from it, right? Because the big clinical benefit assessment is then being done on the European level, and they can basically really focus then on the negotiation. I would not then say that stakeholders or institutions from broader country or bigger countries like Germany, for example, or France would be left behind. I think that's probably not the point. I would probably rather link that to the question before. What if, or what happens if, let's say, 2 or 3 countries, for example, simply take the opt-out, and then potentially even a European joint assessment is not being done? That would probably mean that there might be some kind of left behind countries, right? Because they don't have maybe the capacity, also maybe not the kind of knowledge, right? The expert knowledge in order to really assess such kind of products. So I think that might be then maybe kind of a way where I think I could see that kind of, let's say, more kind of issue, right? You could also see and think about industry, right? I mean, left behind, I would generally say, I think we need to be quite careful how to implement that, if that would really come, for example, for medical devices and diagnostics. I mean, we see those discussions now from a regulatory perspective on the MDR, which is then as well being put into effect, I think, then after the as well further delay due to the COVID-19, I think in 2021. I think that could as well be something as well, I would say, a bit dangerous as well for the different kind of companies, just speaking about the left behind. But again, I think it's important that I think the regulations and the rules which need to be put above that kind of frame need to be clearly defined. And I think that question would need to as well drive, I think, as well, the implementation rules.
Thank you. And the question that will follow that first question about the ones who are profit and the ones who are not. What are your thoughts from the point of the pharma companies? What are they lobbying for? Well, here the participant, she's assuming that there are quite some cost savings at the end, not writing all the paperwork.
Yeah, I think that's actually right. I think there are some countries, I think, clearly stating, look, I think for us it's cheaper. We just prepare as we do for the regulatory agencies, right? One dossier is submitted and then we get the result. I mean, I just want to as well, let's say, put another example in there. I mean, I was closely involved in, I think, probably one of the very successful cost-effective stories in the early 2000s when trastuzumab, Herceptin, was being assessed and evaluated in early breast cancer. Great clinical data, great clinical results, and obviously a highly cost-effective product, right? This was one of the core, let's say, drivers as well to demand from a good number of pharma industries to have further cost-effectiveness analysis by basically all payers across the world, right? We can show that the products we have in our hand are finally value for money. I mean, what we see basically after the launch of the, let's say, quite costly, and Herceptin wasn't for free at that time, right? But for further costly new biologics, probably 10, 12 years ago, that the same industry companies basically put into the brakes, right? Basically try to get rid of that kind of discussion again and just look, health economic cost effective is not exactly what we wanted, right? Because for those products, it's not really applicable. You know, just what I want to say, right? There are always 2 points of the whole kind of thing, right? Yeah. So I think cost is one thing. I think Professor Zweifel also said in our kind of discussion, I think what I mentioned early on in Barcelona, right, is also if you have a monopoly on one side, so you only have one shot, it's also a danger, a potential danger, right? If you try there and if you get a no on the EU level, basically whole Europe is done, right? So that's also something keeping in mind, still having as well as something, I mean, what I mentioned as well early on with the German health politicians and from the insurance side, where they also just said, look, something will come. It's just a question when and how it looks like. So I think the rules need to be driven. And I think it's also keeping in mind, it's not only the now, but it's something, it's also the future. I think what we heard as well early on, ATMPs, for example, as well, something different than the other product, also in terms of, for example, evidence-based. And that's the same, for example, for some of the orphan drugs, right? So there's also something keeping in mind. So if we have that at a European level, one assessment, that's, I think, probably the future, probably. But I think the rules need to be a bit flexible in order to as well adjust, for example, so for maybe also for future kind of new products we do not yet think about, but maybe it might be reality in 5, 7, 8, 9 years. If we now have the rules and they cannot be applicable during that time, it could also be difficult to change that when it comes to that discussion.
Well, last but not least, or it's actually the persons who are come the last in our system, how's about the patient? I mean, for the patients, that might be some advantages. If you look at the analysis we also did with the MedVans team here about the orphan drugs, you know, in Germany, we are pretty good about, you know, German drugs that are like here reimbursed. But then even in EU5, we are dropping down to rates to 70, 60%. And I don't want to know how's about in the small countries, you know, or in the Eastern European countries.
I mean, actually, I you know, I'm coming back to what I said probably just a couple of minutes ago with the last question, right? I mean, just thinking about orphan drugs, it's exactly what you also just said, right? With the orphan drugs, we have, I think, access to basically all products, for example, in Germany, right? We have that specific, let's call it Amnok Light kind of process, and patients basically have direct access. Where I think in some of the other countries, that is not the case because of mostly as well evidence discussion. I just read this morning, I think there's now, I think, or there was just an analysis being published that I think for the 2 CAR T-cell therapies available in Europe, we have now in Germany, I think 26 different clinical centers providing care to those patients. And I think just in comparison, I think Spain, I think has 4 centers. I think think France has 6 or 7 centers, and I think also Italy only has a handful of centers, right? Just giving you that perspective as well, right? I think there could be a benefit for patients, but it's again that kind of green and red light. Just imagine on European level for orphan drugs, they basically give a no-go because of a missing evidence. So it's not a total no-go, right? But let's say a red button, that could also mean that at least in some countries, this is a clear kind of showstopper, for example, for those products. And in other countries, it might be at least very, very difficult. So I think important is still, and that is I think also something which, for example, the GBA and also some of the other quite very much advanced institutions across Europe, for example, in France as well, and they as well just clearly said, we need to discuss now about the methodology being applied, right? And also the methodology being applied for the different kind of products we have in our hands. I think that would be an important component, because otherwise I think the ones who are firstly losing is exactly the patients, what you just mentioned.
Thank you. I think these were all the questions. Some more questions? I don't see any coming up here, popping up here. So then let's just go and look there at our next March webinar on September 24th, same time here at 9 o'clock in Germany and 12 a.m. Pacific time in the US. And we have a wonderful topic with our good friend from Next Step, Guy Eiferman, and the topic will be digital, Stefan.
Exactly. So we will discuss about market access reimbursement for health apps, so for DiGAs in Germany, and I think we have some very good cooperation, some very good examples as well from France. So Guy Eiferman will discuss with me the differences and the similarities between the French and the German approaches, and will be interesting as well to see that I think at least as again, not being a French kind of expert, but from the outside, I think it looks that the French have basically adapted their kind of common process to those kind of new worlds of health apps. And in Germany, we needed a fully new kind of process in order to do that. So we'll see where the differences are, where the similarities are, and I think we can as well already see one of the other good examples from the different countries. So looking forward as well to do that with, again, with you, Lutz, and also with our good friend from France, Guy Eiferman.
Perfect. Well, that's it for today or for tonight. We go now out and drink a beer, and you all stay healthy in all these COVID-19 times here. Always don't forget to wear your mask, clean your hands, don't party, or don't party too much, or just party by yourself. It's also something you could do. Okay, stay healthy, and good night and good luck. Bye-bye.
Perfect. Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.